There is a particular kind of power that does not arrive on horseback, wearing a crown, announced by trumpets. It arrives instead through a side door, carrying paperwork. It speaks in the calm, patient language of contracts and inventories. It does not conquer kingdoms. It reorganizes them from the inside, one signature at a time, until the people who once ruled by birthright wake up and discover that the rules have already changed beneath them. In the summer of 1540, a man walks into a council chamber at Westminster, expecting to discuss the ordinary business of government. He is the second most powerful person in England. He has broken the authority of the Pope over an entire nation. He has torn down monasteries that had stood for 400 years and turned their stone into the king's coin. He has built, from nothing, the administrative skeleton that English government would use for the next 3 centuries. He has personally engineered the deaths of a queen, a saint, and half a dozen men who stood between him and the throne room. Before the meeting ends, the guards seize him by the arms. The Duke of Norfolk tears the collar of the garter from his shoulders and tells him a traitor has no right to wear it. 7 weeks later, his head is on a spike above London Bridge, and the executioner has needed 3 strokes of the axe to get it there. His name is Thomas Cromwell. He was born the son of a Putney blacksmith who beat him, in a town so disreputable that respectable Londoners would not walk its lanes after dark. He died the Earl of Essex, having governed England in all but title. How does a boy with no name, no land, and no education become the architect of the English state? And why did the king who built him also destroy him, within the space of 6 short weeks? Get comfortable. This is a long story, and it rewards patience. We begin, as Cromwell himself always insisted on beginning any negotiation, with the ground truth, where a man actually comes from. Putney in the 1480s is not the leafy London suburb it will one day become. It is a river village of ferrymen, tanners, and criminals, the kind of place where a traveler crossing after sundown is advised to keep one hand on his purse and the other on a weapon. It smells of the wool-fulling mills and the tannery pits. The Thames runs cold and brown past its docks, and the manorial court rolls reed like a ledger of low-grade violence. Assault, fraud, the watering down of ale sold under false measure. At the center of this small chaos is Walter Cromwell, brewer, blacksmith, cloth merchant, and a man who appears before the local courts on a startling number of occasions for infractions ranging from cheating his customers to forging property records. He is, by every surviving account, formidable, litigious, and hard on those around him. His son Thomas will later describe his own younger self with a single blunt word: a ruffian. We know almost nothing about young Thomas's schooling, because there is no record that he had any in the formal sense. What we know instead comes from absence. By the time he is a young teenager, he is gone, not merely from his father's house, but from Putney, from London, from England itself. He crosses to the continent with no money, no connections, and no clear plan, and he does not return for roughly 15 years. This is the detail that explains everything that follows. A boy who leaves home that young, with nothing, does not simply wander. He is running from something, and he is building, out of sheer necessity, a set of instincts that formal education cannot teach. How to read a room full of strangers who owe him nothing, how to make himself useful to men who could crush him without noticing, how to survive first, and worry about belonging later. He surfaces next as a soldier in the French army, present, by his own account and later legend, at the brutal Battle of Garigliano, in December of 1503, a battle his side loses badly. Soldiering does not suit him. He works out, with the same cold practicality that will define his entire career, that there is more money and considerably less chance of dying in lending it than in fighting for it. He drifts to Florence, into the banking house of the Frescobaldi family, at the exact moment the city is the beating heart of the Italian Renaissance. A penniless English boy who once ran from a blacksmith shop is now moving through a world of Medici bankers and humanist scholars, absorbing double-entry bookkeeping, contract law, and fluent Italian. You do not choose the family you are born into. You do choose, over and over, what you make of the rooms you manage to enter. And Cromwell, alone in a foreign country with nothing to fall back on, is about to become extremely good at entering rooms. By the time he returns to England around 1515, he is no longer a Putney ruffian. He is something England has no word for yet, a self-made continental operator, fluent in the languages of law, trade, and money, with connections in Rome, Florence, and Antwerp, and absolutely no title to his name. To understand why a man with Cromwell's particular gifts could rise as far as he did, You have to understand what was breaking apart in England and across Europe in the years around his return. The Tudor dynasty sitting on the English throne is, in the year 1515, barely a generation old and deeply insecure about it. Henry VII had won the crown on a battlefield, not inherited it through an unbroken line of kings, and the family's claim to legitimacy was thin enough that his son, Henry VIII, spends much of his reign privately terrified that it could all be undone. What Henry needs, more than anything else a king can want, is a legitimate son. Without one, the Tudor experiment likely dies with him. At the same moment, roughly 1,000 miles away in the town of Wittenberg, a German monk named Martin Luther nails a list of 95 complaints to a church door, accusing the Roman Catholic Church of selling forgiveness for cash and staffing its highest offices with the relatives of the wealthy. The printing press, still a relatively new technology, turns Luther's local argument into a continental wildfire within a few short years. Pamphlets condemning the Pope circulate from Germany to the Low Countries to England itself. This movement will come to be called the Reformation, and it will, within 2 decades, split Christian Europe in half. Here is the vulnerability those two crises create together. Henry wants an annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, so he can marry a woman he believes can give him a son. Rome, for reasons of its own, chiefly that Catherine's nephew, the immensely powerful Emperor Charles V, effectively controls the Pope by controlling the city of Rome itself, will not grant it. Henry is stuck between his dynastic terror and a church that will not move. This is the gap that swallows medieval certainties and offers openings to men who were never supposed to have any. A king trapped between a marriage he cannot dissolve and a religious revolution already sweeping the continent does not need another nobleman steeped in the old assumptions of inherited privilege. He needs a problem solver who owes the old order nothing, because he has never been permitted to belong to it in the first place. Cromwell, by the mid-1520s, has quietly become one of London's most capable lawyers, specializing in a very particular and very lucrative skill: conveyancing land. At precisely the moment that England's traditional common lands are being enclosed and sold off in vast quantities. He understands paperwork, property, and profit in a country that is about to need a man who understands exactly those 3 things applied to the church itself. When you hear a modern politician promise to cut through bureaucratic gridlock by simply getting things done, you are hearing, whether the politician knows it or not, an echo of the argument that first got Cromwell noticed. Not birth, not piety, not charm, competence, applied ruthlessly. At the exact moment competence becomes the only thing that matters. It is early in the year 1518. Cromwell is standing in a forest outside Rome, holding a plate of jellied sweets, waiting for a hunting party to ride past. He has been sent to Rome by a small church guild in Boston, Lincolnshire, with an unglamorous errand: renew their license to sell indulgences, the paper pardons the church offers in exchange for cash. It is the kind of task 100 other petitioners are also queuing for outside the Vatican, and most of them will wait for weeks and leave empty-handed. Cromwell does something different. He finds out, through patient inquiry, exactly what Pope Leo X actually likes: English choral music, hunting, and sweets. He assembles a small troupe of English singers, discovers the Pope's hunting route, and positions them in a clearing to sing as the Pope rides by. When the Pope, delighted and curious, reins in his horse, Cromwell steps out of the trees holding a plate of jelly. He gets his grant. He gets considerably more than his grant. This episode, small as it sounds, is the whole method in miniature. Cromwell's genius was never really about law, or theology, or even politics in the abstract. It was about seeing powerful men, not as offices to be flattered, but as human beings with specific, knowable appetites, and then engineering a situation to meet those appetites precisely. He was not overawed by rank. He treated a pope the way he would later treat a king, as someone whose weaknesses could be studied and used. This same instinct puts him into the household of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, England's Lord Chancellor and the most powerful commoner in the kingdom, sometime in the early 1520s. Wolsey, himself the son of an Ipswich butcher who had climbed to the edge of the throne through sheer competence, recognizes something of his own trajectory in Cromwell, and puts him to work managing one of his most delicate and profitable projects, quietly dissolving a number of smaller, underperforming monasteries, to fund Wolsey's new colleges at Oxford and Ipswich. Notice what this actually is. Years before the word Reformation carries any religious weight in England, Cromwell is already learning the exact administrative mechanics of closing a monastery, valuing its land, and redirecting its wealth into a patron's ambitions. The dissolution of England's monasteries, the single most consequential and violent act of Cromwell's later career, is not born from theological conviction. It is born from a filing method he perfects for Wolsey a decade before Henry ever needs it done to the entire church. By the time Wolsey falls from grace in the autumn of 1529, having failed to secure Henry's annulment, everyone at court expects Cromwell to fall with him. Instead, in a move nearly everyone at the time considers reckless, Cromwell walks into the king's court and does something no one else dares. He speaks up for his ruined master. Here is what almost no one watching Cromwell's rise fully understood at the time, and what many historians would spend the next 4 centuries arguing about. He was not simply climbing toward power, he was quietly building the machine that power would run on afterward. Medieval English government had operated, for centuries, through the king's personal household, a shifting body of nobles and clergy, who advised the monarch more or less informally, their authority resting entirely on personal proximity to the crown. It was a system built for a king who governed like a warlord, riding out with his court behind him. It was not built for a state trying to manage a nationwide religious revolution, confiscate and redistribute the wealth of thousands of institutions, and administer a growing, literate, increasingly complicated kingdom. Cromwell replaced it. Beginning in the early 1530s, he restructured the king's inner circle into what would become known as the Privy Council, a compact, disciplined body of 10 to 20 men, holding defined offices: Secretary of State, Lord Chancellor, Lord Treasurer, Lord Privy Seal. This was not a cosmetic change, it was the invention of something recognizably modern: a cabinet. The body that would run England, in one evolving form or another, for the next several centuries, exists because Thomas Cromwell built it out of the wreckage of Wolsey's fall. He did the same thing to the machinery underneath it. He overhauled the exchequer's finances, introduced new systems of taxation, and, in an instruction that seems almost incidental against the drama of the divorce and the Reformation, but which quietly outlives every other achievement of his career, ordered every parish in England, beginning in 1538, to keep a written record of every christening, marriage, and burial within its bounds. It is the birth of English civil record-keeping. Genealogists searching parish registers 500 years later are, without knowing it, using Thomas Cromwell's paperwork. You are living inside Cromwell's architecture right now, in ways you have never had reason to notice. Every time a government department processes a birth certificate, every time a cabinet meets to advise an executive who governs through committees of specialists rather than personal whim, every time a bureaucracy quietly outlasts the individual who built it, that is the shape Cromwell gave to the state, because he understood something the old nobility never had to learn: that power exercised through inherited status is fragile and personal, but power exercised through systems survives the man who dies. This is the moment inside the story where the outline finally becomes visible. Cromwell was never simply Henry's fixer. He was constructing, brick by administrative brick, the first genuinely modern government in English history, while simultaneously making himself the single irreplaceable component inside it. It made him extraordinarily powerful. It would also, eventually, make him extraordinarily easy for his enemies to isolate, because a system built around one man's competence has exactly one point of failure. To understand Cromwell on his own terms, and not merely as a villain in someone else's story, you have to sit for a moment inside the argument he actually believed. Cromwell was, throughout his 20s, a document survives from his own hand assessing England's centuries-old obsession with conquering France, and it is worth understanding what that document actually says, because it is the clearest window we have into his real worldview. Henry wanted to renew England's medieval wars on the continent. Cromwell argued bluntly that this was fantasy, that England no longer had the money, the manpower, or the strategic position to win such a war, and that pursuing it anyway was vanity dressed up as glory. Practicality for Cromwell was not a lack of ambition, it was the only ambition worth respecting, because it was the only kind that produced results a country could actually keep. This same cold logic is what carried him, later, past the theological wall that had stopped everyone else. When Rome refused Henry's annulment, most of the king's advisors kept pushing at the same locked door. More appeals, more legal arguments to the papal court, more waiting. Cromwell looked past the door entirely. If the Pope will not grant the king authority over his own marriage, why should the king's authority depend on the Pope at all? Scholars around Cromwell began assembling arguments, drawn selectively from scripture and Old English chronicles, that the English Church had always been sovereign, and that a king answers to God directly, with no foreign intermediary required. It was not, by the honest standards of the historians who would later examine it, a strong argument. It required considerable creative reading of ancient texts. But it did not need to be strong. It needed only to be usable, and Cromwell was a man who valued a usable tool over an elegant one every time. Beneath this, and inseparable from it, sat something that looks, by every surviving trace of evidence, like genuine religious conviction. Cromwell was not merely inventing a legal fiction to please his king. By the late 1520s he was reading Erasmus's Greek New Testament, corresponding with reform-minded friends like the future Bible translator Miles Coverdale, and quietly funding the printing and distribution of an English translation of Scripture into every parish in the kingdom, a project that, in the eyes of traditional churchmen, bordered on heresy in itself. He believed, in some durable way, that ordinary people had a right to read God's word in their own language rather than have it filtered to them in Latin by a priesthood he had come to see as corrupt. Here is the tension the honest version of this story has to hold, rather than resolve. Cromwell's practical genius for exploiting a legal loophole and his sincere belief in religious reform were not competing motives fighting for control of the same man. They were the same motive. He believed, with real conviction, that breaking Rome's grip on England was a moral good, and he was entirely willing to build that moral good out of forged history, manufactured urgency, and the calculated destruction of anyone who stood in the way. It is the 14th of November, 1532. In a private ceremony, conducted in secret, Henry marries Anne Boleyn. Before his first marriage has been formally annulled, before Parliament has passed a single relevant law, before the Pope has issued so much as a comment. Zoom out for a moment. This is not romantic impulsiveness. It is Cromwell's engineering already at work, months ahead of the public timeline. He knows the legal architecture is close enough to finished that the marriage can be backfilled with statute afterward. By January of 1533, Anne is visibly pregnant. The child that will become Queen Elizabeth I is already growing inside her before England's Parliament has legally acknowledged that her mother is the king's wife. Now zoom in. In the House of Commons, Cromwell steers through a bill restricting appeals to Rome, the Ecclesiastical Appeals Act, built on the argument that England has always been, in the language of the Act itself, an empire unto itself, answerable to no external authority. It sounds abstract on paper. In practice, it is the legal trapdoor beneath the entire Catholic hierarchy in England. Archbishop Cranmer, newly appointed with Cromwell's backing, convenes an ecclesiastical court at Dunstable Priory in May of 1533, deliberately held near, but not at, the residence where the exiled Catherine of Aragon is staying, so that the proceedings can go forward without her direct participation. Within days, Cranmer declares the marriage to Catherine void. Anne is crowned queen a week later, already carrying the child everyone in England is praying will be a son. Consider what actually happened to the human beings on the losing end of this operation. Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who has been Queen of England for over 2 decades, is stripped of her title and confined to a series of increasingly remote castles. Her own household staff are forbidden to address her as queen, though many continue in defiance, in private, until her death. She writes, in her final years, that she still considers herself Henry's true and legitimate wife before God, a claim the entire machinery of Cromwell's new legal architecture now formally denies her. She dies at Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire in January of 1536, a mother separated for years from her only surviving child, a queen whose own household still whispered her old title to her in private. By November of 1534, Parliament passes the Act of Supremacy, formally naming Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor and Cromwell's own intellectual peer, refuses to swear the required oath. Cromwell leads the delegation that offers him a final chance to save himself. More refuses again. He is executed in July of 1535. Here is the named contradiction worth sitting with. Cromwell, a man who would spend 1536 funding the printing of an English Bible so ordinary people could read Scripture for themselves, has just helped execute a fellow humanist scholar for refusing to accept a supremacy built on legal arguments Cromwell himself knew were, at best, creatively reconstructed. Conviction and convenience, in Cromwell's hands, had become genuinely impossible to separate. Once a system built to break one institution proves it works, the temptation to point it at a much larger one becomes almost impossible to resist. Beginning in 1535, Cromwell is appointed the king's vicegerent in spirituals, a title that effectively makes him, a layman with no clerical training whatsoever, the king's direct deputy over the entire Church of England, outranking even the Archbishop of Canterbury in administrative authority. He orders a nationwide visitation, teams of commissioners dispatched to every religious house in the kingdom to inventory their wealth and investigate their conduct. The reports that come back describe, in places, genuine corruption, monks living in comfort while neglecting their charitable duties, relics of dubious authenticity sold to the credulous for profit. In other places, the reports describe exactly the opposite: modest, functioning communities that fed the local poor and educated local children, condemned regardless. The logic of escalation does not pause to distinguish between the two. In 1536, Parliament passes the Suppression of Religious Houses Act, dissolving every monastery with an annual income under £200. It is only the opening move. By 1539, the larger houses are being pressured into what the government insists on calling voluntary surrender, a term that grows more strained with every commissioner who arrives at a monastery gate backed by armed men and a letter from London. Within roughly 4 years, hundreds of monasteries, friaries, and nunneries, institutions that had stood, in some cases, since before the Norman conquest, are stripped of their assets and torn down, brick by brick, their libraries scattered, their lead roofs melted for scrap. Here is what enabled each step to make the next step easier to justify. Every pound of confiscated monastic wealth that flowed into the royal treasury deepened Henry's appetite for more, and deepened Cromwell's own usefulness as the one man who knew how to keep the money coming. This is the ordinary mechanism by which a limited, defensible policy metastasizes into something its own architect may not have originally intended. Not a single dramatic decision to do evil, but 1,000 small administrative decisions, each one justified by the last, each one making the next slightly easier to sign. You do not have to look far in your own life to recognize the shape of this pattern. Any institution, a government, a company, a movement, that discovers a revenue stream tied to the destruction of something it has decided is expendable, will find increasingly creative justifications for destroying more of it, faster, long after the original argument for doing so has stopped making sense on its own terms. By 1538, Cromwell has also turned his attention to what reformers call idolatry, the veneration of relics, statues, and shrines. In September of that year, commissioners dismantled the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral, a pilgrimage site that had drawn the faithful for over 350 years. Becket's bones are removed. His name is struck from official calendars by royal order. Even a sainted archbishop, murdered defending the church against an earlier king, is no longer safe from a Tudor state that has learned it can rewrite the past as easily as it rewrites the law. Strip away, for a moment, the language of statecraft and religious policy, and look instead at what the dissolution of the monasteries actually meant on the ground, in the autumn of 1536, in the north of England. For centuries, England's monasteries had functioned as far more than places of prayer. They were hospitals for the sick who had nowhere else to go. They were the only source of organized relief for the region's poor, the elderly, and the disabled. They employed farm laborers, brewers, builders, and servants by the thousands. When a monastery closed, it did not simply lose a chapel. An entire local economy, built up over generations, lost its center of gravity overnight. In Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, this collided with a population already suffering from bad harvests and rising rents. When Cromwell's commissioners arrived in October of 1536 to begin dissolving the smaller religious houses, they were met not with paperwork disputes but with mobs. In Lincoln, the rising quickly swelled into an armed uprising. In Yorkshire, a local lawyer named Robert Aske led a movement that would come to be called the Pilgrimage of Grace. Not a rebellion against the king, its participants insisted, but a plea to remove his evil counselors, Cromwell chief among them, and restore the old religious life of their communities. Within weeks, Aske's following swelled to an estimated 30,000 people. It was, by a wide margin, the largest popular uprising England would see during the entire Tudor century. Consider the ordinary people inside that number. A woman who had relied on the monastery infirmary when there was no other doctor for 20 miles. A farm laborer whose family had worked monastic land for 3 generations and now faced eviction by a new secular landlord with no obligation to keep them on. A parish where the closing of the local priory meant no more alms distributed at the gate on feast days, no more shelter for travelers, no more schooling for children whose parents could not otherwise afford it. These were not abstractions to the 30,000 who marched. They were the entire fabric of a life that had, without their consent, been declared obsolete by men in London who had never set foot in their villages. The rising was ultimately diffused, not crushed outright. The Duke of Norfolk persuaded Aske that the king would hear the rebels' grievances and offered a pardon. Aske dispersed his followers in good faith. It was a trap. Within months, under cover of a fresh, smaller uprising that gave the crown legal pretext, the government moved against the leaders of the pilgrimage with total ruthlessness. Approximately 250 people, Aske among them, were executed. Some hanged in chains in their own towns, left on public display as a warning to their neighbors. The rebels never blamed Henry directly. In their own petitions, their own sermons, their own final words on the scaffold, the name they returned to again and again was Cromwell's, the blacksmith's son from Putney, now the single most hated man in the north of England, blamed by thousands of ordinary people for the destruction of the only safety net most of them had ever known. His defenders, and there have always been serious historians among them, make an argument worth hearing in full before it is dismissed. Cromwell inherited a kingdom with medieval, chaotic, and often corrupt institutions, and in roughly a decade he built the Privy Council, modernized crown finances, established the first system of national poor relief England had ever attempted, and created the parish registers that would give England, uniquely in Europe, a continuous written record of its own population. Under his management, England avoided the ruinous continental wars that had bankrupted Henry's father, and would bankrupt Henry again the moment Cromwell was gone, a fact borne out almost immediately, as Henry plunged into new wars with Scotland and France within 2 years of Cromwell's execution, wars that devastated the very treasury Cromwell had spent a decade carefully rebuilding. His defenders point to the man's personal conduct alongside the political record. His sustained loyalty to his ruined patron Wolsey, when the entire court had abandoned the cardinal. His unusual insistence on educating his daughters as thoroughly as his son, at a time when female literacy was rare even among the gentry. His practice of feeding as many as 200 of London's poor at his own gate, daily, throughout the 1530s. His critics, and they have always outnumbered his defenders, make an equally serious case. Whatever administrative genius built the Privy Council also built the legal machinery that executed Thomas More and John Fisher for the crime of conscience, that manufactured, with cold theatrical precision, 5 separate charges of adultery and incest against Anne Boleyn on evidence historians across 5 centuries have overwhelmingly judged to be fabricated, and that turned a genuine, popular religious movement of over 30,000 people into 250 corpses left hanging as warnings. Whatever administrative genius built the parish registers, also directed the destruction of an incalculable body of medieval English literature and learning, contained in monastic libraries, scattered or burned during the dissolution, a loss some historians have called the single greatest catastrophe in the history of English letters. The same man who wept, by contemporary accounts, when his old patron Wolsey fell from grace, would go on to preside over trials so procedurally hollow that the outcome was frequently decided before the evidence was even assembled. The honest position, the one this account is not going to resolve for you, sits directly between those two cases and refuses to collapse into either. Was Cromwell a genuine reformer who used the only tools available to a man of his birth, ruthlessness, manipulation, and legal engineering, to drag a corrupt, calcified institution into the modern world? Or was he a supremely gifted opportunist who dressed naked self-advancement in the language of conscience so convincingly that even 5 centuries of historians still cannot fully agree where the performance ended and the belief began? Both readings survive contact with the actual documents. That is precisely what makes him so difficult to file away, and precisely why his story keeps returning, generation after generation, to be argued over again. October 1539. A portrait arrives at the English court. It shows Anne of Cleves, sister of a minor German duke whose small Protestant territory Cromwell believes England urgently needs as an ally against the looming threat of a Catholic alliance between France and Spain. Hans Holbein has painted her directly, without obvious flattery, in the careful, level style he is known for. Henry studies the portrait. He is, by every account, pleased. Zoom out. This marriage is, on paper, exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous alliance Cromwell has built his entire career defending. The same cold logic that once told a young Henry not to waste money conquering France. It is politically sound. It is theologically sound. It is, in the language Cromwell himself might have used 20 years earlier, the sensible choice. Zoom in to the 1st of January, 1540, at Rochester. Henry, in disguise, goes to surprise his bride-to-be as she arrives from the continent, playing at the kind of courtly romantic game he has always loved. He embraces her. Contemporary accounts record that Anne, unaware who this stranger even was, receives the gesture with polite indifference. Henry is, by every surviving account, devastated, not by her appearance alone, historians increasingly argue, but by the collapse of a fantasy. The aging king's belief that he could still inspire instant, helpless attraction in a young foreign princess meeting him for the first time. He turns immediately to the man who arranged it. "I like her not," he reportedly tells his ministers. "Get me out of this." Cromwell cannot get him out of it. He is, ironically, too good a lawyer. He has drafted the marriage contract so carefully, to secure the German alliance, that no loophole exists. Henry marries Anne on the 6th of January anyway, and the marriage is never consummated. Within months it is annulled on those very grounds. Here is the short sentence that carries the weight of everything building beneath it. For the first time in over a decade, Cromwell has visibly failed the king at the one thing Henry has always needed from him. Not policy, not law, but the management of his own desires. His enemies do not waste the opening. The Duke of Norfolk, who has despised Cromwell for over a decade as an upstart commoner, elevated above men of ancient blood, and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who has fought Cromwell's religious reforms since their beginning, quietly present a new candidate to catch the king's eye. Norfolk's own niece, Catherine Howard, young, vivacious, and everything the disappointing German princess was not. Where Cromwell had once positioned Jane Seymour in Henry's path to displace Anne Boleyn, his enemies now run the identical playbook against him. Proof that the machine he built for managing the king's marriages could be operated by anyone patient enough to learn it, including the men waiting for the chance to turn it on its inventor. In April of 1540, in a move that stuns the court, Henry grants Cromwell an earldom. It looks like victory. It is, in fact, the closing of a trap. The same elevation, the same brief illusion of unshakable royal favor, that had preceded Anne Boleyn's execution 4 years before. The 10th of June, 1540. Cromwell arrives, by all accounts slightly late, for a routine meeting of the Privy Council at Westminster. He crosses the threshold of the chamber. The cry of treason goes up almost immediately. Guards seize him by both arms. The Duke of Norfolk crosses the room and personally tears the collar of the Order of the Garter, England's highest chivalric honor, granted to Cromwell only 3 years earlier, from around his neck, telling him plainly that a traitor has no right to wear it. His former ally William Fitzwilliam unties the ceremonial garter itself. Within the hour, he is on a barge headed downriver to the Tower of London, the same tower where he had, over the previous decade, sent so many others to await their own trials. The charges that follow are not so much prosecuted as assembled after the fact. He is accused of supporting radical religious sects, of corruption, of protecting heretics, and, in the claim that even his enemies privately regarded as absurd, of plotting to marry the king's own daughter Mary and place himself in line for the throne. There is no trial. Parliament instead passes a Bill of Attainder, the same legal instrument Cromwell himself had once used to condemn others without the inconvenience of a courtroom defense, and it becomes law on the 29th of June. From his cell, Cromwell writes to Henry, appealing not to law but to 2 decades of loyal service. The final letter ends with 3 words, repeated for emphasis, that historians have quoted for 5 centuries as the rawest surviving expression of a man watching his own execution approach in real time. Mercy, mercy, mercy. Henry has the letter read to him more than once. He does nothing. On the 28th of July 1540, Cromwell is led out of the Tower to a scaffold on Tower Hill, to be executed publicly as a commoner, rather than privately as a peer. One final deliberate humiliation. In his final speech, he denies supporting heretics and professes to die in the traditional faith, a statement historians widely read, not as a change of heart, but as a calculated final act of protection for the son and family he is leaving behind, who could be tainted by association with a convicted heretic far more dangerously than with a convicted traitor. The execution itself is botched. Contemporary accounts describe an inexperienced or possibly deliberately incompetent executioner, requiring several strokes of the axe before the sentence is finally, brutally completed. His head is set on a spike on London Bridge that same afternoon. That same day, not the following week, not after a decent interval, but that same afternoon, Henry marries Catherine Howard, Norfolk's niece, the young woman who had displaced Cromwell in the king's favor months earlier. It is difficult to read the timing as anything other than deliberate. The old order that Cromwell had spent a decade humbling watches him die and marries into power within hours. As if to prove, publicly and immediately, how easily the machine could run without the man who built it. It could not in fact run nearly so well, but it would take Henry considerably longer than one afternoon to discover that. Step back now from Cromwell the individual, and look instead at what his rise and fall exposes about the machinery he served. The most unsettling feature of Henrician government was never really its cruelty. Cruelty is common to most governments in most centuries. The unsettling feature was how thoroughly that cruelty could be dressed in the language of due process. Bills of attainder, the instrument that condemned Cromwell without trial, were not some rogue abuse of a broken system. They were a normal, legally sanctioned tool of Tudor government, used by Cromwell himself against others for a decade before it was finally turned on him. A state that allows its legislature to simply declare a man guilty, with no court, no cross-examination, and no defense, has not suffered a breakdown of the rule of law. It has revealed that the rule of law, in that system, was always conditional on remaining useful to the people who controlled it. Consider, too, what it says about a system of government that a king could remain popular, admired, even beloved by many of his subjects, while the machinery beneath him committed the actual violence in his name. Henry was rarely blamed directly for the dissolution of the monasteries, for the executions of More and Fisher, for the trumped-up charges against Anne Boleyn, or even for Cromwell's own manufactured downfall. The rebels of the Pilgrimage of Grace insisted, again and again, that they loved their king and blamed only his evil counselors. This is not naivety on their part. It is a structural feature of monarchies, and, in a more diffuse way, of every modern government since. The person at the top is protected from accountability precisely because the machinery is designed to let ministers, advisors, and agencies absorb the blame for decisions the person at the top ultimately authorized. And there is a deeper, more uncomfortable pattern still. The very qualities that made Cromwell so useful to Henry, his willingness to operate in legal gray zones, his talent for constructing a persuasive case out of thin evidence, his comfort with destroying reputations when the cause demanded it, were precisely the qualities that made him, eventually, a threat that had to be destroyed the moment his usefulness faltered. A system that rewards ruthless competence has no natural mechanism for protecting the ruthlessly competent people it depends on, because the very skills that built their power are also, by definition, the skills their rivals need to take it away. When you hear, in your own time, warnings about unelected advisors wielding more real power than the officials who appointed them, you are hearing a 500-year-old anxiety with a new vocabulary. The Tudor state discovered, through Cromwell, that competence concentrated in a single indispensable person is extraordinarily efficient and extraordinarily fragile, because that person's fall can take an entire decade of institutional memory down with him in a single afternoon. Every bureaucracy since has faced some version of the same unsolved problem. How do you keep the machine running when the person who built it is gone? And how do you stop the machine from becoming, quietly, more powerful than the people it was built to serve? Cromwell's most enduring legacy was not, in the end, any single law or execution. It was the shape of government itself. The Privy Council he assembled in the 1530s did not disappear with him. It persisted, evolved, and became the direct institutional ancestor of the modern cabinet system used across the English-speaking world today. A body of specialized ministers advising an executive, rather than a loose gathering of hereditary nobles. Every time you watch a government announce a cabinet reshuffle, you are watching a structure whose skeleton Cromwell first assembled out of Wolsey's wreckage 5 centuries ago. The parish registers he ordered in 1538 became the foundation of English civil record-keeping, a system that would, centuries later, evolve into national censuses, birth and death certificates, and the genealogical records that let ordinary people today trace their own family histories back through hundreds of years. He did not build this system to give 21st century families a hobby. He built it to track a small, specific religious minority he distrusted. The tool outlived and outgrew its original and considerably narrower purpose, a pattern that recurs constantly in the history of surveillance systems, from parish registers to national identity databases. The justification changes generation to generation, but the underlying machinery, once built, rarely gets dismantled. The dissolution of the monasteries reshaped the physical and economic landscape of England in ways still visible today. The ruined abbeys scattered across the English countryside, Fountains, Reval, Tintern, are not simply picturesque backdrops for tourist photographs. They are the fossil record of the largest single transfer of wealth and land in English history before the modern era. land that passed from religious institutions into the hands of a new class of gentry landowners, many of whom would go on to form the backbone of England's rising commercial and, eventually, parliamentary class. And here is the thread that connects most directly to the world you live in now. The Reformation that Cromwell engineered on the king's behalf did not stay contained to marriage law and church property. It cracked open a genuinely new idea in English political life, that ultimate authority did not have to run through Rome, or even, necessarily, through an unquestionable monarch. That Parliament, the body Cromwell had spent a decade learning to manage and manipulate for royal ends, could itself become the source of legitimate national authority. It is one of history's stranger inheritances that, roughly 100 years after Cromwell's execution, a distant relative of his own family, Oliver Cromwell, descended from Thomas's sister through a nephew who had taken up the family name, would lead the parliamentary forces that put an English king on trial and executed him, using in its own violent way the same argument that Parliament's authority could override a monarch's, that Thomas had once wielded on Henry's behalf against the authority of the Pope. The tool built to make one king absolute became, within a few generations, part of the argument that ended absolute monarchy in England altogether. Cromwell almost certainly never intended that outcome. Almost no architect of a system ever fully controls what later builders do with the foundation once it is laid. There is a question sitting underneath this entire story that the story itself refuses to answer cleanly, no matter how many times historians return to the documents hoping to finally settle it. Cromwell rose from absolutely nothing. No name, no land, no formal education, a childhood shadowed by an abusive father in one of London's rougher river villages, to become the most powerful commoner in English history up to that point. A man who reshaped his country's religion, government, and economy more thoroughly than most kings ever manage. He did it entirely on the strength of talent, applied without mercy, in a society that offered talent almost no legitimate path upward on its own. Every door that opened for him, opened because he was more useful, more capable, and more relentless than the men standing in front of it. And every door he opened for himself, he opened at someone else's expense. Thomas More's family, Catherine of Aragon's household, Anne Boleyn and the 5 men executed alongside her on evidence most serious historians now regard as fabricated. The 30,000 ordinary people who marched in the Pilgrimage of Grace, the 250 of them who were hanged for it, the monks, nuns, and the communities who depended on them, scattered across a landscape of deliberately ruined abbeys. So here is the question, and it is not the same question the opening of this story posed. That question was whether Cromwell was a villain or a visionary, and by now it should be clear that framing was always too simple to survive contact with the actual evidence. The real question is this: in a society that offers a talented person from nowhere exactly one door upward, and that door only opens by serving, absolutely and without limit, the appetites of someone already holding unaccountable power, is it even coherent to blame the person who walks through it for what he becomes once he is inside? Or does the blame belong somewhere else entirely, with the system that built only one door, and made ruthlessness the price of admission through it? Consider it from the other direction too. If Cromwell had refused, if he had drawn some line, at Thomas More's execution, or at Anne Boleyn's manufactured trial, or at the 250 bodies left hanging after the Pilgrimage of Grace, the near certainty is that another man, less talented, less capable of building genuine and lasting institutions, would simply have taken his place and done the king's bidding anyway, likely with less of the accidental good that came bundled with Cromwell's ambition. The English Bible in every parish, the poor relief system, the peace with France that spared England a ruinous war. Does competent, self-aware complicity do less harm than the incompetent kind? Or does it simply make the harm more efficient, more thorough, and considerably harder to stop? 5 centuries of historians still cannot agree. Perhaps that disagreement is not a failure of the historical record. Perhaps it is the most honest thing the record could possibly tell us. Return for a moment to that study in the year 1532, where this story first paused. Thomas Cromwell sits for Hans Holbein, freshly promoted, surrounded by the letters and paperwork of a man whose power runs on documents rather than armies. He wears plain, dark lawyer's clothing, not the silks a nobleman of equivalent rank would have chosen. His hand rests on his papers. His face, in Holbein's finished portrait, gives away almost nothing at all. Historians have spent 5 centuries staring at that same impassive face, trying to read backward through it to the man underneath. The boy who fled a violent household in Putney at an age when most children cannot yet be trusted to cross a street alone. the mercenary who watched his own side lose a battle in Italy, the merchant who once, by his own account, went hungry in the streets of Florence before a stranger's kindness gave him a foothold, the lawyer who wept, genuinely and by multiple contemporary accounts, when his patron Wolsey was destroyed by the very court Cromwell would go on to dominate. None of it shows in the portrait. That is perhaps the most honest thing Holbein ever painted. Not a lie about who Cromwell was, but an accurate record of how completely Cromwell had learned to make himself unreadable, because unreadability, for a man with no inherited protection, was itself a form of armor. Now picture the other image this story has carried alongside it from the beginning. The same man, 8 years later, on Tower Hill, his head separated from his body only after several clumsy strokes of an axe wielded, by most accounts, badly. The same hands that once held out a plate of jelly to a pope in an Italian forest, patient and calculating and entirely in control of the moment, are now bound behind him, while a crowd that has been taught to hate him watches the executioner fail, twice, to finish the job cleanly. Between those two images sits an entire theory of power, that it can be built, with enough intelligence and enough ruthlessness, out of nothing at all, out of a name no one respected, a childhood no one would choose, a country that had no place prepared for a man like him, and that the very same power, built that carefully, that patiently, out of nothing, can be unbuilt in a single afternoon, by the one person who was never required to explain himself to anyone. Henry VIII would go on to marry twice more, wage 2 more ruinous wars, and die, 6 years later, having squandered most of the wealth Cromwell had so carefully redirected into the crown's hands. In the months after Cromwell's death, courtiers reported that whenever the king was dealt a knave and a hand of cards, he would mutter, half in jest, that he had drawn a Cromwell. It is recorded as the closest thing to an epitaph Henry VIII ever offered the most capable servant he had ever employed, and then destroyed. The blacksmith's boy from Putney had spent his entire life building doors where none had existed. In the end, the only door that mattered, the one leading out of the king's favor, was never his to control at all.